Welcome to our Good Friday service. We're really glad that you've joined us. On this night, we remember Christ's death. It's a somber occasion. And on Easter, we celebrate his resurrection. Don't forget to join us as early as 6:30, and then 9, 10:45, 2, and 4. As the weeks carry on through our coronavirus, you may have needs that you haven't shared with us. Please consider sending those to us at connect@thechapel.br. Again, we're so glad that you've joined us.
Hey, good evening. It's Good Friday. We're so happy that you are participating in worship with us. And we really want you to feel that way. Tonight, this is a worship service. So please engage, sing along with us, and let's lift these songs up in a moment of praise together.
Sorrows, Lamb of God, by his own betrayed. The sin of man and wrath of God has been on Jesus' head. Silent as he stood accused, beaten, mocked, and scorned, bowing to the Father's will, he took a crown of thorns. Oh, that rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor unto thee. Of heaven, God's own Son, to purchase and redeem and reconcile the very ones who nailed him to that tree. Sing that rugged cross. And oh, that rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor to thee. My debt is paid, it is paid in full by the precious blood that my Jesus spilled. Now the curse of sin has no hold on me. Whom the Son sets free, oh, it's free indeed. Now my debt is paid, it is paid in full by the precious blood that my Jesus spilled. Now the curse of sin has no hold on me. When the Son sets free, oh, it's free in me. Now my debt is paid, it is paid in full by the precious blood that my Jesus spilled. Now the curse of sin has no hold on me. Who the Son sets free, always free indeed. Oh, that rugged cross, my salvation, where your love poured out over me. Now my soul cries out, hallelujah, praise and honor to thee. Praise and honor to thee. Praise and honor to thee.
Thank you, James and Connor and Amanda. I want to read from Isaiah 52 and 53, hundreds of years before Jesus would be on this earth and suffer and die. The prophet Isaiah told us all about it. Listen to his words. Isaiah 52, starting in verse 13 and going through Isaiah 53, verse 12. See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised up and lifted up and highly exalted. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form was marred beyond human likeness. So will he sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they'll see, and what they have not heard, they'll understand. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like the root out of a dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty that to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. Like one whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities. He carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was like a lamb led to slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. He was assigned to the grave of the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and I will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors, for he bore the sins of many, and he made intercession for transgressors.
Peace, bring it all to peace. The storm surrounding me, let it break. At your name, still, call the sea to still, the rage in me to still every wave. At your name, Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus. Breathe, call these bones to live, call these lungs to sing once again. I will praise Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, 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 you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is a light that the shadows can't deny. Your name cannot be overcome. Your name is alive, forever lifted high. Your name cannot be overcome. Sing out Jesus, 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 you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, oh Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, you silence fear. Oh Jesus, Jesus, you make the darkness tremble. Jesus, Jesus, sing out your name. Your name
going to get worse before it gets better. That's probably a statement you heard from the mainstream media this week, from CDC experts, from medical personnel, that it's going to get worse before it gets better. Now, those are pretty true words for our situation today, but it's also true for what we as Christians celebrate as Holy Week, the week that Jesus rode triumphantly into Jerusalem and just a few days later was crucified on the cross. It's got to get worse before it gets better. And if we know the story of Easter, we know that it gets better. We know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But the question is still this: what do we do in the midst of the worst until the better gets here? What do we do in the midst of the dark tunnel while we're waiting on the light? What do we do when we find ourselves asking the question, God, do you even care? Do you care that my world is falling apart or that the whole world is falling apart? Do you care whether or not I end up getting so angry at my kids, I say something I don't want to because the quarantine is driving us nuts? Do you care if my marriage falls apart? Do you care that I miss graduation? Do you care that I'm missing all these opportunities? God, do you even care? Ultimately, God, why don't you do something about this? Those are the questions I find myself answering whenever I'm living through it's got to get worse to get better. But the reality is, when we look back at Holy Week, we actually see that God did do something about this. He did something about what we're experiencing now. He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, into this world to take care of this issue, to take care of this problem. And He did it by doing something that no one expected Him to do. He did it by doing something that no one even had on their radar for Him to do. And in the story of Good Friday, which we're going to look at today, we see, though, that it got much worse before it was able to get better. So if you got your Bibles, join with me. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 9. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to continue in our series we've been in on Sunday morning entitled Jesus is Greater. And this book of Hebrews was written to an early group of Hebrew Christians, Christians who grew up in the Jewish tradition that decided to follow Jesus. And this book, or was simply just a letter, was written to them to encourage them to don't give up. When you're in the hard, when you're in the throes of life, don't give up, because Jesus is greater than anything we're ever going to face and is sufficient for everything that we're ever going to need. And we've seen that so far in our series. We've seen that Jesus is greater than all the noise, all the distractions of life, all the other advocates, all the other agreements. We've continually seen that He is greater than anything we're going to face and sufficient for everything we are ever going to need. So join with me as we dive into Hebrews chapter 9, starting in verse 11. We're going to see not only is Jesus the greater sacrifice, He is actually the greatest sacrifice. So look with me, Hebrews chapter 9, starting in verse 11. The writer writes, "But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, He went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands, that is to say, is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but He entered the most holy place once and for all by His own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and ashes of heifers sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctified them so that they are outwardly clean." I don't know about you, but that sounds a little weird to me. Actually, a whole lot of weird. I mean, bulls and goats and heifers and ashes and most holy places. Like, what does that even mean? Well, what the writer is doing is he's taking us back to what is called the Old Covenant. And the Old Covenant was an agreement that God made with His people to bring them back into a relationship with Him. Because of our sin, we were separated from Him, and God wanted us to be back in a relationship with Him. So He set up the Old Covenant. And some tenets to the Old Covenant were basically this. There would be a high priest who is the kind of head honcho guy, not really the priest that would do bad things on Friday night, not that kind of high priest, but he was the high priest who would represent God to the people and the people to God. And the way that the high priest would make the people right with God is he would kill a bull, a goat, a heifer, then he would take the blood of that animal, he would enter into the temple where God would dwell. He would actually enter into the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, which is where the Jewish people believed God would dwell. And they would tie a rope around Him just in case He died in there so they could pull Him out. And He would sprinkle blood on what is called the mercy seat. And that blood would pay for the sin and would offer forgiveness from the Lord. And we see that described in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22. It says, "In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So blood would have to be shed for God's people to be forgiven of their sin. And then we actually see this take place in Genesis chapter 3 in the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve first sinned and they were first separated from God, God came and He killed an animal to give them clothing, to cover their shame, to cover their nakedness, to cover the consequence of their sin, showing us that blood has to be spilled in order for sin to be forgiven. But what we see in these kind of weird verses that we just read is that this blood and this sacrifice wasn't complete. It was actually a little insufficient when it came to fully forgiving the sin of mankind. In verse 13, we even say it just outwardly cleansed them. There was only so much the blood of animals could do. That's why the priests had to do it over and over and over, because the forgiveness was never complete. And that is why Jesus showed up, to come and to make a sacrifice once and for all, to spill blood just one time, and then to make sure it never had to happen again. And that takes us to our day in the story of Holy Week, Good Friday. And the night before Good Friday, Jesus and His disciples had what's called the Last Supper, where He washed their feet and He broke the bread and they drank the wine, and He was showing them what was going to happen on the cross. But they ended up going to the Garden of Gethsemane. And while He was there, Jesus put His disciples on guard dog duty. He made them watch to make sure when people came, He would know. And He went off to pray. And we're going to talk a little about His prayer in a minute. But once He finished praying, He came back and He found all of His disciples asleep. They were not very reliable. But whenever they woke up, a mob, a large crowd was coming to arrest Jesus. And arrest Him they did. They put Him in chains, shackles, zip ties, whatever they used back then. And at that moment, the disciple Peter actually jumped up to try to defend Jesus, and he cut off a guy's ear, but Jesus took it and He actually put it back on the guy's ear, and it was like Operation Met Gladiator. Like, it was just a crazy moment. Like, you should read the Bible. It's really, really interesting. But they arrested Jesus, and they put Him on trial, and the next day they crucified Him on Good Friday. And before they crucified Him, though, guys, they beat Him. And just like Pastor Kevin read earlier, He was smitten for us. By His wounds we are healed. And they beat Him with rods. They beat Him with whips. They beat Him with what is called a cat of nine tails that would actually rip the flesh wide open. And He was actually nearing hypervolemic shock even before He ever made it to the cross. And He finally gets to the cross where He's going to be put on full display for all to see, and they drive these huge nails into His wrist, again, putting pain all the way through His body, and they hang Him on the cross, because it's got to get worse before it gets better. And as He's hanging there, it's difficult for Him to breathe, so He tries to pull Himself up to take a deep breath, which makes His muscles work even harder, which makes Him need more oxygen, and just puts Him in this big, nasty cycle where His body literally begins to fight against itself and ultimately begins to shut down. And finally, His heart truly begins to melt. He's in more pain, more unendurable pain than we can ever imagine. But in this moment, we truly see the heart of Jesus when He says out loud, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." Now, was Jesus talking about the Roman soldiers who hung Him on the cross or the Jewish leaders that got Him arrested? Absolutely, He was talking about them. But it wasn't just them He was talking about. He was talking about you, and He was talking about me, because it was our sin which made it have to happen, that Jesus had to die on the cross in our place. Even in the midst of all that pain, we were on His mind. But it wasn't just the physical anguish Jesus was going through, it was also the spiritual pain and the spiritual anguish. Because the night before that prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane I mentioned earlier, Jesus actually prayed, "Father, is there any other way that this can happen? Can you let this cup pass away from me?" But Jesus, knowing there was no other way except the way the Father had ordained, He prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." And when He said that, He actually began to sweat blood, which means He was so stressed and so worked up, His blood vessels literally began to burst, and He sweated blood. Not because of the fear of the cross, but He knew the spiritual agony of all the punishment and all the wrath of God that would set on Him, because He truly became our sin on the cross. And it was in that moment on the cross where Jesus cries out, quoting Psalm chapter 22, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it was in that moment we see Jesus was abandoned by the Father so that we wouldn't have to be. It was in that moment he became our sin. So physical anguish, spiritual anguish, him feeling forsaken, it had to get worse before it got better. And then Jesus said these famous last words on the cross found in John 19, verse 30. He screams out, "It is finished." And we see that after that, he breathed his last and he passed to the Father. And what we see in that moment is Jesus declared that something was finished. And those are three words in English, "it is finished." But in the Greek, and I'm going to geek out a little bit about the Greek, that's actually one word, tetelestai. And the question that I want to answer, and I hope you're asking too, is what exactly was finished? Was it Jesus' life on earth was finished? Well, of course it was. He was dead. Was it the act of murder on the cross with crucifixion? Well, it was done too. But ultimately, it was that his work on earth was finished. The mission he came to accomplish was finished. But even more than that, evil was just finished. Death was just finished. The separation between us and God was completely finished. No longer would fear reign over mankind. No longer would sin reign over us. No longer would guilt and shame plague us for the rest of our life. When Jesus declared, "It is finished," he was talking about everything that separates us from the Father. That is why no longer do we need the old covenant. No longer do we need animals' blood to be spilled. Jesus finished it once and for all. But there's something beautiful I want to share with you about that phrase, "it is finished." The word tetelestai in the Greek is actually in what's called the perfect tense. Now bear with me for just a second. The perfect tense is something that happens in the past but has continuous effect. It has continuous results. It's basically once you get married, it happens at a point in time, but it has continuous ramifications. And I'll let you determine what those ramifications are. But when Jesus says it is finished, he's saying it's finished once and for all, but that has continuous effects from here on out. So as we're living now, 2,000 years later, it is still finished because of the work that Jesus did on the cross. He came and he lived and he died. He went through the worst so that it could be better for us. He said goodbye to life so we could say hello to him, to salvation, to love, and ultimately to freedom from everything we're going to face. That is why Jesus is not just the greater sacrifice, but the greatest sacrifice. And the writer of Hebrews sees that, and he writes about that in verse 14 of chapter 9. He says, "How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from the acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God." I love the way he put this. How much more then, if the blood of goats and heifers and bulls does this, how much more will the blood of Christ, the perfect sacrifice, do for us? How much more will it cleanse us and pull us away from that which leads to death? And ultimately, how much more will it give us the ability to serve our living God, to come back into a relationship with him, to know him, and to be known by him? That is what it looks like for the better to come out of the worse. But I really don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves because, guys, in the moment that Jesus was dying on the cross, in the moment he actually passed away and they put him in the tomb, the disciples and his followers who were there, they had no idea of what was to come on Easter Sunday morning. They had no idea that Jesus would, one, die, much less raise from the dead. They had no idea the better that was coming. They were just sitting in the midst of the worst. Which honestly, guys, is exactly where we are right now with this coronavirus. We don't see the better that is coming. We don't see the freedom that is coming. When we're in the worst, that's all we can see. So what do we do when we're in the midst of the worst, waiting for better? What do we do when Christ is in the tomb and we're waiting for that resurrection? What do we do when we're in the dark, hoping and waiting for the light of hope? Many of us have said, including myself, we allow our faith to trump our fear. And honestly, that can be true to some extent, but what exactly does that even mean? Does it mean that we're not able to be afraid of anything? Does it mean we're not able to look at legitimate things that scare us, like this virus and its ramifications, and be afraid? No, it doesn't mean that. When Jesus said, fear not, he wasn't saying there aren't things to be afraid of. When Jesus said, fear not, he said, I am greater than that which you fear. So place your faith in me. Because faith doesn't remove doubt and fear. Faith trumps doubt and fear. And what we see in the cross is the reason why we can stand up and stand against those things that we fear, is that the one in which we place our faith cares for us. He hears us. He loves us. And He has already done something about this thing that is causing all of us to move into the dark night of the soul. He came and defeated it once and for all. So when we find ourselves in the fire, when we find ourselves in the storm of life, it's not that we aren't supposed to fear that thing. We're supposed to allow our faith in the one who is greater to trump the fear we have in the fire, because Jesus is standing in the fire of life with us. But I just want to let you know, it's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. It's going to get much worse before it gets better. But I want you to remember this. It's only Friday.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in. And when I look at the space between where I used to be and this reckoning, I know I will never be alone. There was another in the fire, standing next to me. There was another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding of how I've been set free, there is a cross that bears the burden, where another died for me. There is another in the fire. And all my debt left for dead beneath the waters. I'm no longer a slave to my sin anymore. Should I fall in the space between what remains of me and this reckoning? Either way, I won't bow to the things of this world. And I know I will never be alone. There is another in the fire, standing next to me. There is another in the waters, holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding, the power set me free. There is a grave that holds nobody, that power lives in me. There is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. Oh, there is another in the fire. And I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to it. And I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between was thick. And I can hear the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. There is no other name but the name that is Jesus. He who was and still is and will be through it all. So come with me in the space between all the things unseen and the reckoning. And I know I will never be alone. And I know I will never be alone. There'll be another in the fire standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters holding back the seas. Should I ever be reminded
How good you've been to me. I've got the joy from every
battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. I can see the light in the darkness as the darkness bows to him. And I can hear the roar in the heavens as the space between we're in. And I can feel the ground shake beneath us as the prison walls cave in. Nothing stands between us. Nothing stands between us. Another in the fire standing next to me. There'll be another in the waters holding back the seas. Should I ever need reminding how good you've been to me? I'll count the joy from every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. I'll count the joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be. I'll count the joy come every battle, 'cause I know that's where you'll be.
I just love the words of that song and what they represent. That when we're in the fire and the storms of life, we are absolutely not alone. And not only is there one in the fire with us, it is one who has defeated the fire. I want to again say thank you for joining us here for our Good Friday worship service. I know it's a little bit more low-key and more solemn, but that's what Good Friday is all about. But remember, Sunday is coming. I want to invite you to join us for our Easter online services. We're going to have a sunrise service out by the lake at 6:30 p.m. We're going to be by the lake, so you don't have to be, so join in on Facebook Live. And also at 9 o'clock, 10:45, and then 2 and 4 p.m. we'll have 4 services for our online Easter services. If there's anything we can do for you, please email us at connect@thechapelbr.com. And always remember, even though it's going to get worse before it gets better, our King has already overcome all the worst, and He is with us. We love you guys, and we'll see you on Sunday.